The hall of Aachen Castle smelled of lavender and wax. Crystal chandeliers trembled with the footsteps of servants. Carpets muffled every sound, and the young Princess Stephanie sat in front of a large mirror, trying on a pearl necklace. It slid down her neck, cold and heavy. At that moment, she did not know, or still pretended not to know, where the money for the luxury that had surrounded her since birth came from. And thousands of kilometers to the south, in the depths of the equatorial forests, a child's hands were dying because another child in Aachen might not know need. Princess Stephanie Clotilde Leopoldovna went down in Belgian history as a noble, well-bred representative of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha dynasty. She was born on May 21, 1864, in a luxurious country palace near Brussels. According to the memoirs of her governesses and tutors, her childhood resembled an idyll. Horse riding, music, French poetry, exquisite balls, visits from foreign ambassadors. For the court, she was not just a girl, she was the key to dynastic success. At the age of 14, negotiations began with the Habsburgs about a possible engagement to the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Rudolf. And indeed, a few years later, this union was concluded. However, while the salons of Aachen discussed dress styles and ball repertoires, another terrible world was being built outside the walls of the African Congo. Her father, King Leopold II, who ascended the throne in December 1865, was not satisfied with Belgium's modest position in Europe. He dreamed of colonies, raw materials, and his own personal empire. In 1884, under the guise of the International Association of the Congo, Leopold achieved international recognition of the Free State of Congo. In fact, his personal fiefdom. Official documents compiled at the beginning of the 20th century estimated the total income from the export of ivory and rubber during his reign at 1,100,000,000 francs. This money directly financed the construction of palaces, the organization of receptions, and the maintenance of the royal family and courtiers. Some sources explicitly state that the income from the Congo was used to restore the royal palace in Laeken, expand the residence in Aachen, and purchase dozens of precious jewels, including the necklace worn by the young Stephanie in the portrait. Did she know about this? The evidence varies. The diaries of one of her tutors, Baroness Duval, mention that the girl asked several times why her father was receiving parcels from a distant black country. She was told that gifts were coming from there, coffee, tobacco, ivory, when, in 1891, already at a mature age, she was again confronted with stories of colonial atrocities. She asked for the first time, according to those close to her, "Was my house built with this?" She did not share this question publicly. But traces of her inner conflict surfaced in her letters. Short, but written in a strong hand. Leopold II kept control of the Congo until the very end. Resistance within Belgium itself was growing, but it had little power. It was only in 1908, after international pressure, investigations, Edmund Morel's publications, and missionary testimonies, that the king was forced to hand over control of the territory to the state. The campaign was heated, but there were no open admissions of guilt. Leopold himself never apologized for what had happened. However, the damage to the family had already been done. Immediately after his death in December 1909, litigation began over the property that had become a bloody legacy. Stephanie, already widowed and living modestly, found herself embroiled in a protracted legal battle, where she had to prove that her share of the estate had nothing to do with African crimes. Ironically, it was she, who had always kept her distance from her father's affairs, who found herself under siege by his legacy. Her personal share included real estate, some jewelry, and accounts whose origin was disputed. Court records from 1910 to 1915 contain testimony, letters, and attempts to refute the connection between her childhood and the mass atrocities in the Congo, without success. The public, having read newspaper reports about hand-cutting, starvation, and slave labor in rubber camps, did not want to believe in the innocence of the ivory princess, but her guilt lay more in ignorance, in silent consent and detachment cultivated by court etiquette. This made the contrast all the more striking. A well-mannered, musically gifted girl, the object of admiration in European courts, lived in an environment built on pain. Her family celebrations were paid for with hard labor, her necklaces with fear. And perhaps she was no different from other princesses of her age, whose lives flowed far from factories, mines, and colonies. But in Stéphanie's case, this contradiction became visible, acute, and inevitable. Because it was before her very eyes that the legend of Little Belgium turned into a confession of great guilt. And if you are interested in such pages of history where shadows lurk behind the mirror-like surface of society portraits, subscribe and stay with us. In the next chapter, we will reveal Stéphanie's personal correspondence and see how love and duty, guilt and silence intertwined in her fate. Princess Stéphanie's childhood began in the quiet castle of Aachen, located near Brussels, where she was born on May 21, 1864. This world was both cozy and gloomy, because just a year after her birth, on December 10, 1865, her grandfather, King Leopold III, died, and her father, Prince Leopold, ascended the Belgian throne under the name of Leopold II. Her father's accession to the throne did not bring joy to the whole family. Shortly after this tragic event, in January 1869, her older brother, Prince Leopold Ferdinand, who was born on July 12, 1859, died. His untimely death deeply shook the Belgian court, plunging everyone into mourning and increasing the tension between the king and Queen Marie Henriette, whose relationship was becoming increasingly cold and distant. In this atmosphere of sadness and internal conflict, little Stéphanie grew up, surrounded by strict court rules and a constant sense of loss. In early 1871, when the princess was only 6 years old, Brussels was struck by an outbreak of typhoid fever, a dangerous disease that seriously undermined her health and left long-term consequences, affecting her physical condition and mood. The illness and the constant restrictions imposed on her due to her health exacerbated her inner isolation, turning her childhood into a series of painful trials and loneliness. From 1874 to 1878, the princess underwent rigorous court training. Under the supervision of chamberlains, she studied French, German, and English, mastered the art of music, and perfected her rhetoric skills. These lessons were not just education, but part of her upbringing, designed to prepare her for life in high society and her future role in dynastic politics. Despite all efforts, Stéphanie remained a withdrawn and serious girl whose soul was filled with a sense of responsibility and the weight of family tragedies. Her inner world was shaped by loss and illness, which left a mark on her character, making it both resilient and vulnerable. At the same time, outside the shadows of childhood, preparations were already underway for the day when the princess would enter the world of political intrigue and dynastic alliances that would determine her future fate and role in history. Princess Stéphanie's childhood was spent in an atmosphere where the joy of birth coexisted with the heavy burden of family losses and constant mourning. She was born on May 21, 1864, at Aachen Castle near Brussels, into a family that was already undergoing difficult trials. Shortly after her birth, on December 10, 1865, her father, Prince Leopold, ascended the Belgian throne as Leopold II, inheriting the crown after the death of his father, King Leopold III. However, the joy of the new reign was overshadowed by tragedy when, in January 1869, Stéphanie's older brother, Prince Leopold Ferdinand, whose passing was a heavy blow to the entire family and particularly exacerbated the tense relationship between the king and Queen Marie Henriette. This loss plunged the court into deep mourning, which hung like a heavy cloud over Stéphanie's childhood, shaping her inner world in a climate of constant loss and disunity. In the early 1770s, when the princess was only 6 years old, Brussels experienced an outbreak of typhus, and Stéphanie became seriously ill in January and February 1771. The illness left her with long-term health problems that accompanied her throughout her life and reinforced her sense of fragility and vulnerability, despite her outward strictness and discipline. Between 1874 and 1878, the princess underwent rigorous court training, which included learning several languages, French, German, and English, as well as music education and rhetoric lessons under the close supervision of chamberlains. This educational program was designed not only to ensure her a respectable position in society, but also to prepare her for her future role in the complex political game of dynastic marriages and alliances. Despite all efforts, Stéphanie remained a withdrawn and serious girl whose soul was filled with a sense of responsibility and the weight of family tragedies. Her inner world was shaped by loss and illness, which left a mark on her character, making it both resilient and vulnerable. At the same time, outside the shadow of childhood, preparations were already underway for the day when the princess would enter the world of political intrigue and dynastic alliances that would determine her future fate and role in history. The winter of 1878 brought not only cold and snow to the walls of Schönbrunn Palace, but also important conversations that would forever change the fate of the young Princess Stéphanie. At the court of Emperor Franz Joseph, her candidacy as a bride for the 20-year-old heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Rudolf, was being discussed. This union seemed logical and advantageous. It would strengthen ties between Belgium and Austria-Hungary and create a solid dynastic bridge between the two great houses. The importance of this step was also emphasized by King Leopold II, who, in a letter dated March 15, 1880, officially approved the engagement, pointing out the need to strengthen political alliances in the changing European situation. Time passed, and May 10, 1881, became the day when the solemn wedding ceremony took place in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. According to the recollections of contemporaries, more than 5,000 guests attended the ceremony. Representatives of high society, diplomats, and courtiers, all of whom witnessed this important event, which was to mark the beginning of a new era in relations between the two kingdoms. However, behind the glamour of the ceremonial dresses and the solemn music lay another, darker side to this marriage. Already in the first months of their life together at court, there were worrying signs of alienation between the spouses. Silent coldness, restraint in communication, constant supervision by chamberlains, and a strict ban on personal correspondence created an atmosphere in which feelings and trust gave way to formal duties and court intrigues. This union, conceived as unifying and strengthening, gradually turned into a soulless formality where each side played their role, not allowing themselves true intimacy. The question that preoccupied many contemporaries and remains relevant for historians is why such a promising dynastic union was doomed to alienation and coldness. The answer lay in complex political and personal circumstances, in expectations that did not match reality, and in the fact that deep contradictions were hidden behind the outward glamour. But this was only the beginning. Shortly after the birth of their daughter, on whom great hopes were pinned as the continuation of the family line, events began that would forever change Stéphania's life and leave an indelible mark on the history of two empires. The price to be paid for this marriage and the dark shadows that would fall on the fates of the main characters would become clear in the following chapters. But even then, it was clear that dynastic interests often require sacrifices that are not always visible at first glance. The winter of 1878 brought not only cold and snow to the imperial palace of Schönbrunn, but also tense discussions about the future of dynastic alliances. Among these conversations, the name of the 14-year-old Belgian Princess Stéphanie was heard more and more often, as she was seen as a potential bride for the 20-year-old Archduke Rudolf, heir to the Austrian throne. At the court of Franz Joseph I, this proposal was seen as an opportunity to strengthen the political and family ties between the two great houses of Habsburg and Bourbon. King Leopold II, recognizing the importance of such an alliance for Belgium's stability and influence, officially approved the engagement in a letter dated March 15, 1880. In this letter, he emphasized the need for rapprochement with Austria-Hungary, which remained one of the key players on the European stage, and hoped that the marriage of Stéphanie and Rudolf would become a symbol of a lasting and mutually beneficial alliance. The 10th of May, 1881, was marked by a solemn wedding ceremony in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, where, according to the recollections of contemporaries, more than 5,000 guests gathered, representatives of the highest nobility, diplomats, and courtiers. This day seemed to embody the dream of harmony between two great dynasties, but soon the first signs of alienation began to appear behind the facade of glamour and ceremony. The young couple's relationship was strained and formal. There was an unspoken coldness between them, and the court chamberlain strictly monitored their every move, not allowing the slightest spark of sincerity or freedom. Personal correspondence was forbidden, which only intensified the feeling of isolation and alienation. The union, conceived as a political bridge between Belgium and Austria-Hungary, turned out to be doomed to soulless formality, where everyone's role was predetermined and personal desires and feelings were subordinated to dynastic interests. This marriage, despite all its pomp and significance, became a symbol of how politics can suppress humanity, turning destinies into instruments of great games. The answer lay in complex political and personal circumstances, in expectations that did not coincide with reality, and in the fact that deep contradictions were hidden behind the external glamour. But this was only the beginning. Shortly after the birth of their daughter, on whom great hopes were pinned as the continuation of the family line, events began that would forever change Stéphania's life and leave an indelible mark on the history of two empires. The price to be paid for this marriage and the dark shadows that would fall on the fates of the main characters would become clear in subsequent chapters. But even then, it was clear that dynastic interests often require sacrifices that are not always visible at first glance. In the fate of Princess Stéphanie and Archduke Rudolf, a period began when the shadows of betrayal and illness began to inexorably destroy their marriage, like invisible but deadly threads. On September 22, 1883, they had a daughter, Elizabeth Maria, who was referred to in court documents as Elizabeth Maria Henriette Stéphanie. It seemed that the birth of a child could be the beginning of a new chapter in their family life, but it soon became clear that their happiness was deceptive. As early as 1885, court physicians diagnosed Stéphanie with severe inflammation of the peritoneum, peritonitis, but modern historians, after carefully studying the surviving medical reports, concluded that the true cause of her suffering was venereal diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea, which were most likely transmitted to her by Rudolf himself. These diseases not only undermined the princess's health, but also deprived her of the opportunity to have more children, which was a tragedy in the eyes of the dynasty. Meanwhile, from 1886 onwards, rumors about the Archduke's numerous affairs became increasingly vocal at court, especially about his relationship with the young Baroness Maria Wetz, who was born in December 1871 and died tragically in January 1889. These intrigues only exacerbated tensions within the family, undermining trust and respect. Rudolf increasingly fell into bouts of drunkenness, his behavior becoming unpredictable and at times dangerous, as noted in the memoirs of his valets and courtiers. Under these circumstances, Stephanie was forced to submit to strict control. She was forbidden to appear near her husband without supervision, and she herself, exhausted by illness and betrayal, gave up her attempts to restore intimacy and trust. Their marriage finally fell apart, falling victim not only to Rudolph's personal weaknesses, but also to court intrigues, illness, and the dynasty's unfulfillable expectations. The question of whether Stephanie could have saved this union remains open, but it is clear that her fate was predetermined by a combination of her husband's vices and cruel circumstances. All this created a gloomy backdrop against which the fateful denouement unfolded. The tragedy at Mayerling, where personal dramas and political intrigues intertwined, becoming a symbol of the downfall of one of the most prominent figures of the Austrian imperial family. Life at the court of Emperor Franz Joseph was rarely peaceful, and for Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, it turned into a real tragedy, where love and hopes were shattered by cruel realities and betrayals. On September 22, 1883, the couple had a daughter, Elisabeth Maria Henriette Stéphanie. This child was a long-awaited event, but the joy was overshadowed by the fact that it soon became clear that the marriage, which seemed strong on the surface, was hiding deep cracks. In 1885, court physicians diagnosed Stéphanie with peritonitis, an inflammation of the peritoneum, which at that time was considered a serious and dangerous disease. However, modern historians, having studied the surviving medical reports and documents, have concluded that the true cause of the princess's illness was venereal infections, syphilis and gonorrhea, transmitted to her by her husband, Archduke Rudolph. This painful truth not only undermined Stéphanie's health, but also became a symbol of the decaying relationships within the imperial family. Since then, starting in 1886, rumors about the Archduke's numerous affairs began to spread more and more frequently at court. One of Rudolph's most famous mistresses was the young Baroness Maria Vetsera, born in December 1871. Despite her young age, her relationship with the Archduke became the subject of gossip and intrigue, which only exacerbated Stéphanie's situation and her position at court. At the same time, Rudolph increasingly sank into alcohol binges and exhibited unpredictable behavior, as confirmed by numerous recollections of valets and courtiers. His outbursts of anger, depression, and alienation made normal communication with his wife and those around him impossible. Deprived of support and understanding, Stéphanie was forced to submit to the strict court rules that forbade her from appearing near her husband without supervision. Her attempts to restore intimacy and trust proved futile. She gave up further attempts to save the marriage, realizing that it was already beyond repair. This union, originally conceived as dynastic and politically advantageous, finally fell apart, falling victim not only to Rudolph's personal weaknesses, but also to complex court intrigues, illness, and the impossible expectations placed on both spouses. The question of whether Stéphanie could have saved this union remains open to this day. On the one hand, her fate was predetermined by a combination of her husband's vices, infidelity, alcoholism, and illness, and on the other hand, by the harsh circumstances in which she found herself a prisoner of court life and political ambitions. All this created a gloomy backdrop against which a fateful denouement loomed, the tragedy at Mayerling, where personal dramas and political intrigues intertwined, becoming a symbol of the downfall of one of the most prominent figures of the Austrian imperial family. It was these events, filled with pain and betrayal, that foreshadowed the terrible finale that forever changed the course of history and left a deep mark on the memory of contemporaries and descendants. No one expected that one day in the quiet hunting lodge of Mayerling, located not far from Vienna, a tragedy would occur that would shock all of Europe. On January 30th, 1889, the bodies of Archduke Rudolph heir to the Austrian throne, and Baroness Maria Vetsera were found there. According to the official report of the Vienna Police, number 187, the investigation concluded that Rudolf first shot Maria and then killed himself. This news shook not only Austria-Hungary but the whole world, giving rise to a multitude of rumors and speculations. In a farewell note left by Stéphanie, Rudolf's wife, there were words full of contradictions and pain, "You and I forever," which only added to the mystery and tragedy of what had happened. Emperor Franz Joseph, Rudolf's father, immediately gave orders not to allow Stéphanie to return to Belgium, where she was born and where their daughter was, until custody of the child was finally settled. This gesture clearly showed how deeply the court saw her as a threat, or, at the very least, an undesirable participant in political and family intrigues. On February 15, 1889, the international press, including the influential newspaper The New York Times, published a version according to which the tragedy could have been not just a personal drama, but the result of complex political games and conspiracies, which only added fuel to the fire of public interest and speculation. For Stéphanie, this meant not only the loss of her husband and loved one, but also a sharp decline in her status at the Habsburg court. From a beloved and respected duchess, she became an isolated figure whose freedom was restricted and whose reputation was undermined. Her life became a prison, where her every move was controlled, and a return to her former position seemed impossible. The question of whether the widowed duchess would be able to regain her freedom and restore her lost respect remained open and troubled many who knew her fate. The Mayerling tragedy was not only a personal catastrophe, but also a symbol of the complex relationships within the dynasty, where politics and family were intertwined in the most dramatic way, forever changing Stéphanie's life and the fate of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. January 30th, 1889, will forever remain a dark date in the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The bodies of Archduke Rudolf and Baroness Maria Wetzer were found in the Mayerling hunting lodge, located near Vienna. This tragedy, officially recorded in the Vienna police report under number 187, shocked not only the Viennese court, but all of Europe. The investigation, conducted under the close supervision of the imperial family, concluded that Rudolf first shot Maria and then killed himself. Despite numerous speculations and rumors, this version was recognized as official and became the basis for understanding the reasons behind what had happened. The farewell note left by Stéphanie, Rudolf's wife, reflected conflicting feelings and deep personal drama. The words, "You and I forever," testified to a complicated relationship and unresolved passions, which were probably one of the causes of the tragedy. However, the consequences of this incident went far beyond personal drama. Franz Joseph III, Emperor of Austria and Rudolf's father, immediately ordered that Stéphanie not return to Belgium until the issue of custody of their only daughter had been settled. Thus, the Duchess found herself isolated, deprived of the opportunity to freely dispose of her fate and care for her child. The international resonance of the incident was enormous. On February 15th of that year, the New York Times published a version according to which the Mayerling incident could have been the result of political intrigue, which only added to the tension and distrust of the official explanations. For Stéphanie, this meant not only the loss of her husband and loved one, but also a sharp decline in her status at court, where she was now viewed with suspicion and alienation. Her life turned into imprisonment, where her every move was controlled, and a return to her former position seemed impossible. The question of whether the widowed Duchess would be able to regain her freedom and restore her lost respect remained open and troubled many who knew her fate. The Mayerling tragedy was not only a personal catastrophe, but also a symbol of the complex relationships within the dynasty, where politics and family were intertwined in the most dramatic way, forever changing Stéphanie's life and the fate of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sometimes fate presents a person with a choice that changes their entire life forever. In the spring of 1890, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, daughter of King Leopold II, allowed herself to break with strict dynastic rules for the first time and entered into a romance with Polish Count Arthur Podocky. Their relationship was full of tenderness and hope, but tragedy quickly cut short these dreams. In March of that year, Arthur died after an unsuccessful throat operation, leaving Stéphanie in deep mourning and contemplating the meaning of life outside the framework of royal expectations. Despite this loss, the princess's heart could not forget her desire for true personal happiness. In the late 1890s, she found comfort and love again in the person of the Hungarian aristocrat Count Elimir Lonyai. Their romance was not just passion, but a real struggle for the right to make their own choices. Because in order to marry Stéphanie, Lonyai had to convert to Catholicism, a step that reflected the seriousness of his intentions and his willingness to change for love. In secret from her family and courtiers, on March 22, 1900, Stéphanie and Elimiro were married in Miramar Castle near Trieste. This act was both a liberation and a tragedy for the princess. She lost her title of Princess of Austria, and her father, King Leopold II, officially disinherited her and forbade her from attending the funeral of his mother, Queen Maria Henrietta, in 1902. This cruel move deprived Stéphanie of all her privileges and set her on a difficult path to fight for recognition and the right to live her own life. Family ties that seemed unbreakable proved fragile in the face of personal choices and feelings. Despite all the hardships, Stéphanie did not give up on her love and continued to defend her right to happiness, which became a symbol of her inner strength and determination. However, the consequences of her actions were not limited to personal drama. The conflict with her father and the loss of her official status affected her position in society and the dynasty, forcing her to face new challenges that she had to overcome in the struggle for the inheritance after the death of King Leopold II. This story of how one woman found the courage to go against tradition for love and the price she had to pay for it remains forever in the memory of those who knew about the complex intertwining of power, family, and personal happiness in an era of great change. In the spring of 1890, Stéphanie's life suddenly changed. She began an affair with the Polish aristocrat Count Arthur Podocky. This feeling, which seemed like a breath of fresh air after difficult family dramas, turned out to be short-lived. By March of that year, Arthur had died after an unsuccessful throat operation, leaving Stéphanie in deep grief and contemplating her own fate. However, time did not stand still, and in the late 1890s, she began a new romance with Hungarian Count Elimiro Lonyai, a man who was willing to go to great lengths for her. In 1899, Lonyai converted to Catholicism to legitimize their relationship, which was a serious step given the religious and political complexities of the time. Despite pressure from her family and society, on March 22, 1900, Stéphanie secretly married Lonyai at Miramar Castle near Trieste. This act had far-reaching consequences. She was stripped of her title of Princess of Austria, which meant not only the loss of status, but also a break with her former life. King Leopold II, her father, officially disinherited her and forbade her from attending the funeral of Queen Maria Henrietta in 1902, which became a symbol of the final break between them. Stripped of all her privileges, Stéphanie was faced with a choice: either submit to her father's will and give up her personal happiness, or fight for the right to be herself. She chose the latter, despite all the hardships and public condemnation. This conflict with her father and the loss of her official status not only affected her position in society, but also forced her to face new challenges. After the death of King Leopold II, she was faced with the task of defending her right to inheritance, which turned out to be a difficult struggle, full of intrigue and legal obstacles. Nevertheless, Stéphanie did not give up on her love and continued to defend her right to happiness, which became a symbol of her inner strength and determination. This story is about a woman who found the courage to go against tradition for the sake of love and the high price she had to pay. Her fate remains forever etched in the memory of those who knew about the complex intertwining of power, family, and personal happiness in an era of great change, showing that even in the most cruel circumstances, it is possible to remain true to oneself and one's feelings. The life of Stéphanie, a princess whose fate was closely intertwined with the great events of the early 20th century, ended against the backdrop of the dramatic changes that shook Europe. After the death of King Leopold II in December 1909, Stéphanie and her sisters were drawn into a complex legal battle over the inheritance, which lasted several years and ended only in 1915, with a compromise agreement worth 5 million Belgian francs. These events were only a prelude to new trials that befell Europe with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914, a tragedy that sparked the start of World War I. The war brought the bitterness of the German occupation of Belgium, but Stéphanie and her husband, Count Lonyai, found the strength to devote their efforts to charity, organizing aid for wounded soldiers at the Rusov estate in Austria-Hungary. It was a time of trials and self-sacrifice, when the princess's personal drama was intertwined with the fates of thousands of people caught up in the turmoil of war. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in October 1918, Stéphanie remained in Hungary, where she devoted herself to literary work, publishing her memoirs in 1935 under the title I Should Have Been Empress, which was published in English 2 years later. In these memoirs, she attempted to make sense of her complicated life, full of hopes and disappointments, love and loss. The princess spent World War II at the Penhalmel Abbey near Vienna, where she lived out her final years, far from social intrigues and political turmoil. Stéphanie died in August 1945, leaving behind not only a legacy of charity and literary work, but also unresolved family conflicts, especially with her daughter, which were never fully reconciled. She was buried in the crypt of the abbey, where many members of the aristocracy rest, and where her memory lives on among those who valued her courage and fortitude. Despite her published memoirs and known facts, there remains a sense that the true story of Stéphanie, the princess who could have become empress, is hidden behind a veil of personal experiences and secret dramas that have yet to be revealed. Her life became a mirror of an era when grandeur and tragedy went hand in hand, and people's fates were decided at the crossroads of history, leaving us with questions about what remains untold and what truth she took with her into eternity.